Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this event on mothers' harm and the Northern Ireland conflict. My name's Cheryl Lawther, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a reader here in the School of Law, and it's my pleasure to chair this event this afternoon. I was saying to Andre Murphy, one of our speakers earlier on today, that I've been looking forward to this event for months, and I do genuinely mean that. It is such an important piece of research, and you get to hear the findings firsthand, fresh and original here today. And of course, these events are all the more important in the context of the Legacy and Reconciliation Act that was passed in September 2023. And obviously, as you know, closes down a lot of the avenues and the opportunities for recovery of truth about the past. So bringing the voice of the most marginalised members and the most silenced members of the community into visibility is of increasing importance. In terms of the state of play this afternoon, we have speakers. Andre Murphy, who is the Deputy Director of Relatives for Justice, will speak first. And then she will be joined by Professor Fionnuala Aoláin, who is quite literally on the road on her way from an event in Ukraine. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet Finn yet, she is Professor of Law here in the School of Law and Professor in Minnesota. She has also just recently completed a very successful term as UN Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Human Rights. So she will be joining us hopefully in about 10 minutes' time. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Andre. We do also have a number of people joining us online. So when our speakers have finished this afternoon, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, and I will monitor that. So any of you who are joining us online, please feel free to come in over the audio or to use the chat bar, and I will pick up your questions. But for now, I'll hand over to Andre.
They can hear, they can see. She's 7 minutes away.
Thank you very much. Lovely introduction. And if you can bear with me, I have kind of notes in a couple of different places around this. The idea, I suppose, of working with victims and survivors of the conflict will often be framed by others who work outside of it around legal obligations, and more often, I think, around the idea of therapeutic support for people who have experienced a trauma. And when you're on the outside, that can seem like the two distinct areas where people get supported if they have been bereaved or injured as a result of the conflict. And our understanding of trauma and around victim survivors can often be framed by that. What actually happens when you're working with victims and survivors is that it's an awful lot about what you notice and what gaps you notice in particular. So you'll notice the things that are available, and then you'll notice the things that aren't available. And it's engaging with those and supporting people in the different forms of needs that they'll have around that. And that's fairly much what came around with the idea of doing a project for mothers who'd lost children during the conflict. Now, those children could have ranged from whatever age, but the experience of women who lost children during the conflict was particular and unique. And our previous chairperson, Claire Riley, who's, if you know her, just this amazing woman who was part of the Association for Legal Justice in the 1970s, taking contemporaneous evidence at the time, worked very closely with Monsignor Raymond Murray and Father Fall at the time. And knew families really, really well. And what she would say to someone like me was, it's different for mummies. And in that, so much was captured. How we would support those women in a room would always be different. But I'm not saying we notice something that everyone else doesn't notice. We all do it, don't we? When there's something horrendous happens in a family and a mother loses a child, whatever age, we all do engage with that woman differently. And we do know that there is something about her loss that is so profound and so particular that we want to engage in that. And we do that, you know. How do you translate that into a support service? And how do you translate it into identifying what are those differences for mummies that we know? And that's what we tried to set about doing. And by coincidence, myself and Clara were at a wonderful conference held by Hannah's House in 2016. Thank you so much. Thank you. And Fionnuala was speaking at it. And she was talking about maternal harm and her research with survivors of the Holocaust and the particular experience of mothers who lost children during the Holocaust. And when she got up and spoke, myself and Clara went, there you go. It's not just us. We're not making this up. Here it was. Here were the differences being noticed in an academic world, but that act of noticing, actively noticing and saying there is something different here. Let's record it. Let's get a data set. Let's ensure that we respond to that in terms of identifying needs and then finding resources. We always knew was going to be a long time. So when we started in 2016, we went through the Relatives for Justice database at the time, and there were 360, I'm going to say 2, but could be wrong on that, mothers who'd lost children during the conflict. And we recorded their particular experience, the age that they were when their children were lost, what age their children were, whether they'd had access to remedy, whether they'd had access to compensation at the time, all of those different parts to our research. And it was quite, you know, difficult. That data was not particularly available, and it was very much engaging with those women on a one-to-one and asking them very complex and difficult questions and recording that. We were doing it, and then along comes COVID and interrupts all of that. And then in 2021 and 2022, we were looking at the legacy bill and how these women, these mothers, might be affected by the legacy bill in particular. And we went back to our data and we went back to what we had done, and all of those women was down to 86 women. They had passed away because they're of this generation. And that is how quickly we are losing that generation of people, of victims and survivors, and in particular these mothers. And their age profile had obviously, they are now very elderly. They are now a particular constituency of women who the Legacy Act is affecting in a very particular way. But they're also women that we can't trundle out to press conferences or to protests outside of courts, or, you know, they're not going to be involved in those big kind of set pieces. And we are so responsible for ensuring that that act of noticing is done in an appropriate way and in a non-abusive way. So what we decided to do was to do a photographic exhibition to try and insert these women's particular experience of conflict and also the immediacy of the Legacy Act. And so we did a photography exhibition and we held it in Botanic Gardens during the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And I suppose we had a number of different reasons for doing that, as I've explained, but primarily it was about acknowledgement. It was about saying to those women that we absolutely see you. We understand that your experience has been different and particular, and we understand that this Legacy Act is going to have a profound effect. Because we weren't just speaking to those women by then, we were speaking to the other siblings of the people who had been killed. Again and again, you go into homes and someone will say to you, when our Sean or our Jenny was killed, we also lost my mummy that day. Because the change of the role of that mother changed so completely. We have tried to capture some of that, what that means for that often eldest sibling and also for that woman, to say, what is it that was so different? How did she become this active parent on Monday and then become absent the next day? And that is not that, and I want to say that in the kindest way possible. That is not an observation that this woman became a purveyor of harm, because she absolutely didn't. But the loss was so profound, and how she could parent was affected so completely, and the family dynamic changed so completely. It was about noticing that and not just having that as a little line or an anecdote in yet another testimony by yet another victim and survivor. It's saying, right, there's something really important that's being said in this. It was about acknowledgement for those women and also for those siblings, because obviously how we support those siblings is changed and different as a result of them saying we experienced this in our home. So all of that has been really important. So what we've done in the period since we launched the photographic exhibition was to speak to every single one of those remaining mothers. And we did that during the summer because there's so few of them now that is quite achievable. And the types of recurring themes that came up for us were really important. So grief, overwhelming, and a sense of emptiness. These are very women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s talking about, you know, this being overwhelming still. For some of them, their children had been killed 50 years ago. They still feel that overwhelming. Some of those women have experienced more than one child being killed. The other one is this sense of torture. The word torture was continuously used, pain and torment, about whether they could have prevented their child's death, but also that society, the courts in particular, keep on provoking this feeling of torture, that their pain is not being acknowledged, there is no remedy for them, and they are being actively discriminated against. They'll talk about, they'll use the word trauma to talk about flashbacks, about nightmares, about speaking to their children. That really active PTSD form of trauma. It's not just, you know, a word that's used in a glib way. The word desolation is used, where they're talking about feeling abandoned. Nobody can understand the pain of a mother other than another mother. And that is so isolating from their spouse, if they were alive at the time, and from their other children as well. They will talk about being physically present, but emotionally they can't connect. And imagine feeling like that for 50, 40, 30 years. Many experience very severe health concerns now after, and it isn't just getting older. Many of them will have conditions that we will absolutely link to trauma, such as fibromyalgia, such as ME, you know, and those types of conditions that we are only now beginning to connect to trauma. And with the regional trauma network developing, we're starting to do research into that. And the intergenerational impact. I think this is really important for those women who will speak. On the Orma Road, not far from here, there's a little plaque to the people killed on the Orma Road in Sean Graham's. And it's a quote: "The bullets keep on traveling through time." And that is repeated again and again. It is not an incident that happened 50 years ago. It is happening now for this family. It is alive right now. And that's why legacy is so important. In many ways, the Legacy Act, the legacy debate, victims and talk about victims and survivors is not about the dead. It's about the living. It's about saying that that memory matters, that experience matters, and this impact matters, and that we will, as a society, choose to do remedy rather than choose to do neglect. And that is really, for those women, really connected to the intergenerational part. So for them, they want it overwhelmingly, they want it to die with them. They do not want their children to have to continue on. They don't want their grandchildren to be carrying the placards, talking about impunity, talking about a bill of shame. They don't want that for their family. They want their future to be better than her past. And that is so important for them, and why the Legacy Act is one of the many reasons why the Legacy Act is so cruel for them. And I suppose connected to that is a sense that they want a healthy memory. They want a healthy memory of the person who was killed, not the circumstances in which they were killed. And only by doing truth, justice, acknowledgement, can we do that? Can we do that for those women, to say there will be a healthier memory? I can remember a woman coming in and asking us to explain to her now teenage son how she could explain to hello how she could explain to the now this is 20 years ago, right? I am this age doing this work now. how she could explain to someone who'd been a child when their brother had been killed that he actually wasn't killed by a fridge falling on him, because there was now a memorial garden with his name going on it. And now it was time that she had to do that. She couldn't find the words. She had come up with a kind lie and a kind space to be able to explain the absence of that person, which didn't threaten her younger children, where they might be involved in trouble or they might be at risk. All of those really kind things that she had done were all coming back on her, and she felt that she was doubly responsible and in some way culpable for everything she had had to do in order to cope. And of course, we were able to support her, and we were able to put all of that together. Imagine if a victims and survivors support organization that she didn't trust hadn't been available to her. What would she have done in that time? So that was really important for them. So I think, to understand mothers is to pay attention and to notice. And that is really the biggest part of, how do we academically write noticing? How do you not rely on the Claire Rileys just to notice? How do we build that into policy? So I suppose what is important for us is to say, look, on dealing with the past, we're doing it all awfully anyway, right? We couldn't be messing this up more if we tried. If we went out last year or 10 years ago, we couldn't mess it up more. But if we were going to try and do it right, if there was a will anywhere, so say we went back to Stormont House Agreement time, right, when everyone wanted to do this and everyone wanted to be victim-centred, that term that's thrown around. What would we do differently? We'd put a gender lens on it. Because as soon as you put gender in, then you start seeing the different parts of women's experience, and those women who are mothers would be noticed, right? Because policy asks us to put a lens on that. And that's really important. We would also say that when we were developing policies, that we wouldn't do them in silos. So we'd ensure that there was a policy that addressed the financial and welfare needs of the bereaved. And Luke is here as well, the huge gap that there's been around the bereaved in terms of reparations is just, it's beyond scandalous. But we would have noticed it and we would have put it in. And when we did that, then we would see the stories of the women who were given £6 to bury their children. We would see the stories, and we would start to repay, not just in terms of money, but in terms of society acknowledging that was a really awful thing to do, that compounded your pain when you were burying your child because they weren't of economic worth at the time. And that burns today as much as it did then. And we would also see the interconnected needs. So I began by saying we often see victims and survivors in legacy through two ways: the legal element, which seems very active, and very proactive, and very campaigning-y sort of thing that's happening, and then what's often seen as softer, but isn't one bit, the therapeutic element of support that the same person needs, and the same person will have different needs for at different stages of their lives. And what we would do is join that up. We would join it up and stop kind of seeing that if we do law over here and we have someone coming along and they do a bit of trauma training, sure, isn't that grand? We all understand trauma now. That we see this as an absolute journey. It's a journey of supporting needs, and those needs will change. And our understanding of how trauma is experienced by different genders, by different ages, and with different physical ailments will all change as well. And we need to be responsive to that. And, when we have a DSM-4 that talked about PTSD, and now we have complex PTSD, because our understanding of trauma has changed even within diagnostics, that we all catch up with that. And that is so linked to whether a person has had access to remedy in the legal sphere as well. And if we can somehow join up those dots, because that's how a life is led. And particularly for mothers who will be looking at those needs for very rarely themselves, but for all of the other children, for their husband, for maybe their parents. And then maybe they might be noticed in the middle of all of that. And someone might say, what about you? Because for so often they were not seen. as important. And I think that's what's really, you know, if we're going forward and we're looking at building policy, it's about being interconnected, it's about applying lenses, it's about being responsive, and ensuring that we're talking to each other in that way. So maybe that's a broad overview of why we do the work that we do, and I'm more than happy for us to do the questions and whatever afterwards.
Thank you very much, Andre. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Professor Fionnuala Aoláin for the second part of our presentation this afternoon. She's quite literally just here on a whistle stop tour, so maybe let her catch her breath. Do you need to plug that in?
No,
Anna?
I'm
You're
good.
to
I'm
go?
just going to talk to it. Yeah, thanks everyone. Sorry, I am late. I was in Ukraine for Human Rights Day. I traveled with a group of human rights lawyers to Lviv, which is the city actually which gave birth to the Universal Declaration. Hersh Lauterpacht was a son of Lviv, and his work was the start of the intellectual work for the Universal Declaration. And also this is the city that gave birth to Raphael Lemkin, who was the author of the Genocide Convention, which is also sharing its 75th anniversary just 2 days ago. So I left Lviv very early this morning, so apologies in advance. And there was a lot of traffic from Dublin. But I actually think it's really important to talk about mothers. And one of the things that I think, as I talk about the work that I've done with Andre and with Relatives for Justice in recent years, is also to acknowledge that in the context of the war in Ukraine, we now have an ICC warrant against the president of Russia and the Children's Commissioner of Russia for the abduction of children. And so that actually speaks to a new centering on the understanding of what the meaning of the loss or taking of a child in a conflict is. That act has finally moved into the mainstream of international criminal law. And that as that has happened, and I was really struck by this over the last couple of days, meeting with mothers and lawyers in Ukraine, how the harms that women have experienced as mothers are also more visible to kind of the masculine body of international criminal law, which has historically not only been, I think, very poor in examining gender-based violence, that I think we all know, but there's a broader litany of what we might call maternal harm that has in fact largely been absent from the corpus of international criminal law and has gone ignored. And so maternal harm has been one of my own obsessions for quite some time. And after work, which actually primarily started looking at the Holocaust and looking at what happened to women who were separated from their children during the Holocaust, I was, over many years of talking to Andre, convinced in our discussions that there was a real kind of absence of acknowledgement of maternal harm and maternality as a site of loss and harm in the context of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And I want to start by acknowledging that maternal loss is a complex and it's a multi-dimensional experience. And some of the information and the data I'll share today is from a body of work which we did with Andre, where actually we tried to provide a better understanding of the material, social, and psychological context in which bereaved mothers have functioned in Northern Ireland. And to do that, we felt we needed data. We needed data on the women themselves, on marriage, on education, on employment, on age, on their roles, and of the circumstances of the child's death. And we also wanted to garner a better understanding of what was happening during the course of the conflict over time to maternality as a site of harm and a site of actually lack of remedy, lack of acknowledgement. And so the one thing that I'll say that's missing from this data is ethnographic data. Maybe this is my post-UN world where I might get time to do an ethnographic study, but it's also to acknowledge that, you know, for a particularly vulnerable group, and women who've lost their kids in the conflict are a highly vulnerable group, that it doesn't take
it really, the role of an organization like Relatives for Justice is absolutely critical, because it's not, you know, academics can bumble into these things and see themselves as well placed to do, but it is really through relationships of trust with those who have experienced loss that actually we can do ethically appropriate work that actually, you know, understands the fundamental rule of doing no further harm to those who've already been deeply harmed. So one of the things that brought me to RFJ, not of course standing a long-term relationship, is that Relatives for Justice is one of the only organization, maybe there's more now, Andre, but at the time was the only organization that was mainstreaming gender analysis in everything it did. And it was also running its data through a gender, and they wanted to understand what was happening as from a gendered perspective in every part of their work. And that dates back over a decade. It's Andre's work. And I think acknowledging that RFJ was really ahead of so many organizations in understanding that we couldn't really understand the cost of the conflict if we weren't doing that kind of work. I think when we tried to do in this was I wanted to collect a core. I needed 50 cases so I could run SPSS. So that was the core we needed to be able to gather data on 50 mothers, 50 women who had lost one or more children during the conflict. And for the purposes of the conflict, we took the starting point as 1969 and we finished with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. That said, there are cases that fall outside of that should be regarded as conflict-related maternal harm, but that was the kind of, you know, that was the gates we chose. And what we used was a uniquely structured questionnaire, which was designed to sort of provide core empirical evidence on the background so we could understand the situation of these women and then draw some further analysis from what we'd learned about them. And there were multiple choice questions, and there was the attempt was to have a range of options that would capture the complexity of women's lives. And so the first part of the questionnaire covered things like demographic relevant to each bereaved mother, their age, their level of education attained, their geographic location, because we really wanted to figure out things like rurality versus urban loss, community affiliation. We also wanted to know about the deceased child. We wanted to know the age of that child, the gender of that child, the birth order of that child, all of these things really important to the mother, but also really important to understanding the societal situation of how that loss was felt, but also what the sort of structure of law and social service and other things, how they then intersected with the family. We also wanted to understand the political dimensions of each death, including the manner of death, the agent responsible for the death, whether there was evidence of collusion in the death, whether the child had been a volunteer in a paramilitary organization. And then we also finally wanted to look at what happened after the child's death for the mother. Life changes, including economic consequences of loss for a mother, marital consequence, did people stay married or not after, whether or not they had other children. In fact, vast majority, almost no women had children after the death of a child. So that's a very telling thing in its own right, and how their health suffered, what their health situation was. And we also wanted to understand if they had any services available to them. So there's a lot of data. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I did want to share just some of the kind of primary findings, and then happy to answer more. Let me just say there's a big literature, some of the literature here is around maternal harm in conflict, which is an emerging field of study. There's an interesting sub-literature on the role of gatekeepers, and that I put Andre and I a little bit in that, but certainly the role of RFJ. Also, I think, a transitional justice literature about transition and how maternality. So that's the background literature that frames the work. So in terms of the demographics, it's worth noting that the vast majority of these deaths of the children that we identified happened I use the structure of my own book, The Politics of Force, that describes 3 phases to the conflict. The militarization phase is the early phase. The vast majority of deaths of children occurred in the militarization phase of the conflict, which is 1969 to the end of the 1970s. And so that's consistent with the high numbers of deaths in other parts of the conflict. And so that means that the vast vast number of the women who are now still here with us are in their 80s. Many of them are very old. And so that was 48% of the sample at the time were over 80. And I think one of the things that underscores for me is the extent to which this group should be a massively high priority group for services and a massively high priority group, because as I'll talk about, they have an enormous range of particularly health, social and economic challenges. And to underscore what Andre said, have experienced both neglect and invisibility through the course of the conflict. So that's the first. Age, 48% of the sample are now over 80 years of age. Urban-rural distinction, really important. We found, now there's probably some sample bias here because we were even though RFJ has a presence in other parts of Northern Ireland, it's primarily an urban organization. But we found that over 2/3 of the women came from, the deaths were urban deaths. They were living in urban areas. And so that also relates to the concentration of deaths during the conflict being a largely urban phenomena, but also then requires us to think about what city-based loss looks like. What does it mean to kind of navigate loss and harm through the landscape, the cityscape of the conflict? But also, I think we have an instinct, and this isn't based on the data, that further work is needed on rurality and loss, given, of course, the lack of services and access for women in particular. So 33 of the women lost their children in urban context, and the remainder lost them in rural areas. We wanted to understand how many of these women, what their economic situation was. And so we noted that at 32% of the mothers were living alone. And so that for me was a real prompt to see the vulnerability and isolation of these mothers and their potential lack of access to both formal and informal systems of care. 64% of women are living with family members. And I think one of the things that underscores the ecosystem of family and its relationship to loss, but also, as Andrea and I talked about at some length at the time, the complexity of family relationships around that. And one really driving thing as we think about maternal harm is the role of daughters, primarily daughters, in providing the ecosystem of support for their mothers. So there's a highly gendered care structuring of loss. It's felt by women, but also it's daughters who are playing this role, and also playing a really unique role in protecting their mothers, which is both for the non-lawyers. I think that's just a very interesting way to think about what's happening in these family ecosystems. One of the things that we also found out is that the educational attainment of these women was generally quite low. And so that also reflects kind of a structure of women's access to education and economic opportunity for the vast majority of the group who experience loss. So 44 of the women out of our sample of 50 had less than secondary school education. There were no A-level women with A-levels in our group. There was 2 women who had an undergraduate degree. And so again, in this there's lots to say to tease out about this data, but it tells you then about what the kind of what the resources available, where they were sitting in socioeconomic terms, what the lack of economic support to these women would have meant. 2 other things that 2 other data points. One is we talked about children, and most women who lost a child had a mean number of children of 4.87. That's the number, but it also speaks to family size, family patterns of sort of larger families. But it's also really interesting, as I said, that none of the women had another child after the violent loss of a child. And I think that's super important. Birth order is very mixed. It's worth noting that the sex of the child, to go back to the gendered nature of this data, the sex of the child was predominantly male. And so 92% of the children who were killed were boys. And so we generally think about gendered impacts of the conflict through the lens of gender equals women or women and children, one word. But it's really interesting also to think about the loss of boys in this society, the violent loss of boys, and the way in which that would be culturally and socially understood as the loss of provision, security, what the stand-in for a boy is in our society, and particularly in if we think about when the vast majority of these deaths occur. The other thing that became really clear is the loss of the boy child was also correlated to economic impingement for these women. So again, it's understanding the gendered fault lines, accepting them for what they are, and then seeing the consequences of what particular gender losses look like. One of the other challenges we saw was that that this pattern of gendered loss in conflicted societies is not unique to Northern Ireland, but I think it has generally also been underappreciated what it means to think about the patterns of the loss of life through a gendered lens. And then to understand the kind of roles that both genders are playing in the conflict. So it was 47 boys were killed and three girls, when you think both statistically and just the raw numbers. One of the things that I want to say about boys, and I've been I have two boys, which may be why I'm obsessed with thinking about harm to boys, but I am always struck about the way in which we don't talk about the vulnerability of boys in society, how we generally we think of vulnerability as coupled with women, but not think about vulnerability as a kind of an experience of the male child. And so if you think about the young male child in Northern Ireland growing up through the conflict, their exposure to death, their exposure to serious injury, and their exposure to the serious threat of the same, and the way in which that has shaped masculinities and vulnerabilities in society, in this society, I think is a really, for me, this comes out of the data very, very significantly. I also do want to say about something, and then I'll maybe pause, and there's a lot of data, but just to talk a little bit about the nature of the child's death. And because in this first phase of the conflict, 1969 to 74, this militarization phase was characterized by the deployment of the army bears the primary responsibility for the vast number of the deaths of children in this conflict. And I think in the context of the discussion around legacy bill, reframing what's being lost and reframing what narratives we are missing, and an understanding of the responsibilities for what is not a neutral thing. It actually is bounded in very particular experiences of harm. It's also really clear that in this phase, in this militarization phase, the violent death of a child would have meant very little recourse to any legal remedy. Not just the absence of civil remedies. If they were there, they were highly limited. And I think the data also reveals the way in which women and men, husbands and wives, family members made impossible choices to take civil compensation that was wholly inadequate to the value of their child's life. And that raises a really whole and interesting secondary set of questions for me about the rights of those individuals to actually further an ongoing compensation, as we recognize the intergenerational costs of those deaths and actually value those lives in a different way now. Two other things, sort of subgroups of loss that I think are important to note. There was a subset of children killed by paramilitary groups. And I think, as Andre and I also talked about, we talked about the kind of vulnerabilities within vulnerabilities. So obviously the loss of a child is a deeply traumatic experience. But if that loss happened inside a community where there was like a shared understanding of the meaning of that loss, and even if it wasn't externally validated, there was like support systems, at least at the community or familial level. For mothers who lost children who were seen in punishment shootings, so-called punishment shootings, in violent harm by a non-state group inside their community, the isolation and violence to that mother and that family is really layered, because they often lacked, and we've had many conversations about this, and they lacked the infrastructure of support, deeply isolated. Whereas and I'm going to say this, I'm saying it, and I'm going to say it's complicated. Mothers who lost highly prominent children or children who were killed often play a very, the word that comes to mind for me is venerated role, but they're these complex roles. And we can think of some mothers that we know who have this very unique role because their child was a particularly, the death of their child was internalized by the community in a particular way. And then you have these other mothers whose children were seen as disposable by their own community. And that's a really complicated discussion. Finally, I just want to say, I think the overall takeaway, we have lots of data on the economic circumstances of these women, poor, health situation, poor. Really interesting data on the that these women were highly medicated. So the response to trauma, particularly in this militarization period where you see the highest number of deaths, is pills, lots of medication, and then long-term issues of dependency and non-functionality by those women in their families, and really complicated relationships between the moms and their kids, because they were often not in a position to protect their kids from the conflict. And bearing in mind, again, that where a child was killed by, let's say, a member of the security forces, that family became highly visible to the state, highly regulated by the state, highly like the state, you know, there's private and public families. These families, including their funerals, were not private anymore. These were places where the state exercised its coercive power over the ritual of death, but also then the management of that family's presence in the community. And so I think noting that many of these mothers, I would say, have a complex relationship to their kids because they didn't function very well. And their children, in some cases, were more vulnerable. Not always, but sometimes more vulnerable. Final data point, which is really interesting, is about the husbands, the men. And we don't have enough data on this. We just have a couple of data points. But one is that generally folks stayed married. So that the statistics on people separating are low. But I think I have an inkling, and maybe Andre just that there's a lot buried in there, that what happens to family structures in the aftermath of enormous loss and is enormously complex. But actually the spouses, and I don't have the number pulled up on my shortlist, but a lot of the spouses, the men, died very young. So there's a high percentage of widows in this group. And so I don't have good ethnographic data for this, but my instinct is that men, the spouses who lost, there's another story to be told about the men whose children died in this conflict and how they managed trauma and loss and had, if there's very little support for grieving women, there's much less support for men whose children died, because a woman could grieve or be seen to grieve, but maybe men could not. So, you know, those who have the privilege of grieving and those who don't. So I'm happy to answer more questions. We have to write this up. The paper with the data is on SSRN, so you can see the raw data, but I'm glad to answer questions with Andre. So do you want me to use that? Okay, thanks. Okay. John,
Perfect. Thank you very much to both Andre and Finn. I'm sure you will all agree with me that that was fascinating, or two fascinating presentations with so much depth and so many layers in there that I think that could will keep us here for the rest of the afternoon at the very least. But now is a chance to hand over to those of you who are present in the room or who are joining us online. So if anyone has any questions, please fire away. Okay, we'll go Bill and then Sean and then over here. Okay, start with Bill.
The two of you have opened up a Pandora's box, but then what would I expect? There's another sort of slight category in there. I don't know if you've done anything on it, and that is partners who have lost female partners, who were mothers or not, who are, men who lost female partners. Now, they're a very low percentage of the dead. But there's a particular thing in there, and I'm thinking of two people jump to mind, or two cases jump to mind, is Jim McConville's kids and what they went through for all the years afterwards. Or Jim McCabe, who, you know, his wife was killed with a plastic bullet, and he's left not only to campaign for justice, but to raise kids, including an infant, where there was nothing was preparing him for that. Have you got anything on that?
No. So we haven't done the data on it, but it's really important again to look at how few women were killed during the conflict. So it was rare for, you know, so those two families that you're speaking about, or other families, there wasn't going to be widowers organizations, right? There wasn't going to be a lot of men that men could speak to gain support from that. And the ones that we're even thinking about, they're spread across the decades as well. So they're very, very different ages, the men that would have experienced that. What we really deal with are the surviving children, because again, the men died young. The men who survived did die young. I mean, Jean McConville's husband had already passed away by the time of her murder. And then I'm thinking about a number of others. And this shows why a gendered lens is so important, because as soon as you look at this set, then you think this one here. And it's so important, because if you don't do that, if you don't do that active noticing, look what you lose. You lose that opportunity to acknowledge and to learn. But for the surviving children of those women who were killed, there is really important work to be done for them. Again, you know, the compensation courts treated those families really, really badly, because they weren't, you know, economic units at the time. Most of them were working in the home or whatever. And an awful lot of those children ended up within the care system as well. So you see this line that hasn't been drawn properly yet between the historical institutional abuse inquiries and dealing with the past, and you see the same people within those.
I think it's really like there's work to be done, Bill. I was also thinking one of our students, Seamus Campbell, has been doing a lot of work on vulnerable men in Northern Ireland. I mean, really thinking about the category of civilian men in Northern Ireland, thinking about like, how do we understand not just femininity, but masculinity. So there's a lot said about like violent masculinities in this society, and we definitely have a lot of those, we've had a lot of those, but also the men who are playing these other roles, right? Caretaker roles, family roles, justice campaigner roles, you know, and I think, you know, again, it's a little bit of sort of opening up a space to recognize the multiplicity of roles that men played in this conflict, and because that starts to shift like the way we think about or kind of over typify even roles. Like we have a very stereotyped view that really doesn't reflect what was happening in families or communities, and doesn't actually reflect what the conflict forced on people, actually. Yeah.
And what I would add into that is that grandmothers then begin to play a really important role within that as well. And they go completely neglected, and, you know, there they walk into these roles as well.
Thanks, Fionnuala, and thanks, Andrea, very much. I am a PhD student here at the School of Law, and my research actually looks at conflict-related victimhood in rural areas in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to pick up on that geographical distinction that you have mentioned. In my research, so I'm out conducting interviews at the moment, and in my interviews so far, like the early findings are telling me about issues for victims and survivors in the aftermath of conflict. So one of them would be anonymity. So in rural areas, you know, where everyone knows everyone knows who you are. So I'm thinking of one actual victim survivor's testimony that I had listened to in an archive, and it was how one woman in the aftermath of losing her child was stopped by the security forces and harassed, but also how anonymity would stop, you know, would prevent maybe rural victim survivors from speaking out about their experiences. Another one is proximity. So the likes of going to the court to pursue justice, and then at proximity to support services. So for example, victim survivor groups, and how in the absence of this, victim survivors gain support through the likes of, their churches or from their local, community structures. And another big finding so far is the presence of fear still in rural areas. So I'm wondering if you can speak to this, and in the rural Pacific interview or questionnaires that you've done, if any of this came out as well.
Can we start? Yeah.
No, like I think that's amazing work, really. And yeah, like I also think this is sort of from an international human rights perspective. We just passed a Human Rights Council resolution this year on the rights of rural people, right? Imagine we've never had like that as a legal framework to understand rights within that. There's specific needs and rights of rural people. And like the work of that is actually in the roots of Latin American peasant movements and sort of taking on rurality as a place of rights. I think we had so little data that I can't say that we can illuminate any of your questions, but I do think this point about like what's different, what's defining harm in rural settings that's different from urban settings. And what are and those are important distinctions intellectually, but they're also practical in terms of realizing justice for families in spaces that are not urban. And I mean, Andre could speak to how hard it is to get even in urban areas, but the infrastructure of presence.
Absolutely. And, we have done similar work in talking to all of the mothers, and they are right across the north, so urban and rural areas now. And isolation and loneliness is so enormous because even from we did our work, we really see that if there were spouses alive then, many of them have passed away now. You're seeing women who are living on their own. There is far less community care that was available even a number of years ago. So you're seeing the impact of social welfare, social cuts and, health cuts. That's making a massive difference. And even things like not being able to access GPs anymore. There's only a receptionist down the phone. So there may have been a trusted relationship with a local GP. That's all going now. And that really matters when you're in your mid-80s, you're really isolated and your health is declining. And so how do you start talking about weaning off any of those antidepressants or sleeping pills or anything like that? Or that really matters as well. And it matters in urban areas, but it's amplified completely in rural areas, much more, where you just see the swathes of cuts making such an impact. Victims and survivors groups are trying to do some of that work in the absence, but it's not working. It really isn't. So a couple here, and then we'll come back to it.
Hi, I'm Mary Liz Burns, and thank you so much for the conversation. I had a couple of questions, that one maybe from data and one for ethnography. Did you ask the women if they had or were able to have conversations within the family about what happened, even throughout the years that you were looking at? Did that make a difference? And knowing that the men had stayed, I was wondering if there was even less people to talk to, but did those conversations happen? Did they make a difference? And then I work on domestic violence prevention in the States, and on trauma, it is often what type of assistance were these women looking for? By whom? The messenger, like who could come to them? When is the right time to approach them? I think that's part of the challenge we see with domestic violence, is that there's a lack of trust of whom to reach out to, who should be the one to connect. And so we hope the trauma will never happen again, but if it does, the lessons learned from this research, how would it be approached differently?
The issue of silence is massive, in family after family, and, how that looks in terms of the public profile of legacy of the conflict. So many of the narratives that we are now hearing, so many of the engagements with the civil courts in particular, and some of the inquests as well, have been that parents have passed away and now the family can do it because it was too painful while the surviving parent was alive. And you will hear that again and again. For many families, sitting down around doing specific projects will be the first time that they will have actually shared memories of what happened. So we're doing a GAA project, for instance, we're just kind of concluding it. And members of the GAA who were killed have never been compiled in one place, kind of unbelievably. And it is amazing how many times we went into rooms and the families had spoken about the person who'd been killed for the very first time with a collective memory. It is incredible. Those silences were brilliant protective mechanisms for many decades. They were ways people were able to cope. But after 30, 40, 50 years, their efficacy starts to wear down, and how we can support people will kind of move toward sharing stories in a really safe way, going to your point, you know, and Anna will know this as well in terms of oral history, you know, how we do it in a way that's safe and supportive is so important.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when we as a researcher, I was negotiating with Andre, who was negotiating with the moms, but also with their daughters, mostly actually. And actually there was, I think one of the reasons that there wasn't a question about, there was a real protectiveness about asking questions that would kind of, even though it was anonymized, it was, you know, and it was we were trying to get primarily descriptive data to put like a shape on this thing of maternal loss and have some place to start. There was a huge reluctance. So we actually have very little, we have almost no data on the micro of family dynamics, except the observational data of negotiating, which is also part of the story of the research project, meaning like it tells you a lot about what communities and families want to. And I think it goes back to this trust and who's the valued interlocutor to do that work in a safe way. I would also say though that like one of the things is that like when you think of how old this population is, it goes back to like how do we capture these stories, right? How do we know? And I'm also struck like the analogy for me goes back to work I did as a young academic on Holocaust survivors and it's sort of, if you look at the sort of what we know about silence within Holocaust families and the ways in which like extreme trauma resulted in extreme silence and extreme and unwillingness. I think this isn't unique to Northern Ireland. I think we have lots of data from lots of places of extremity that tell us that actually this is how protection works. But it's also really clear, and it goes to maybe transitional justice at the individual level, how disabling that silence is from like how people's capacity to live a full life, a person's capacity to integrate what happened to them. Like a loss of a child is a profound loss for a parent, whether it's through a violent act or illness. So, you know, the loss of a child is an incommensurable harm. So how do we live with incommensurable harms? And what does it mean in a society where you've had so many incommensurable harms? Like the aggregation of incommensurability is a lot for a society to bear. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about more about the urban sort of thing as well. So you said you talked about urban and rural, but did you do multiple urbanized areas like Belfast and maybe Derry? And if so, were there any through lines or were there any differences between those places compared to like size, and also sort of on domestic violence as well? You know, with like other time as well. I wondered if any from the interviews, if that was a line that came up with anything as well, because often trauma as well, because we said earlier about men not being able to express grief, and that's sort of a thing with domestic violence, is that, you know, it's sort of a through line with mental health. It's very complex, but I wonder if that was something that maybe came up.
I mean, I would say on the yes, we had more than Belfast for the urban data because it's RFJ's community that we were privileged to work with and to access. and so I don't actually, I didn't see a difference in the data sets. We didn't do interviews, so that's why there's teasing. That's what I mean. The next piece of work would probably need to be this kind of safe ethnographic work that would be able to kind of tease out if it made a difference if you were in Dungannon or Belfast or Derry, or, you know, that might make a difference. I think on the, Andre will know far more than I do about these dynamics within families, but I think, you know, grief is a very, grief, loss, fear, all of these things are, and obviously it's a little bit like as we watch what's happening in Gaza, you know, like there's no escape from it. Like it's around you. There's loss compounded by other loss, compounded by like anticipating loss. Like it's an ecosystem of like loss. So where violence, my sense is, and again, this is mostly through conversations with Andre, that it's a very complex space around violence. Your point about institutional, the relationship, vulnerable families, exploitation, violence, and also resilience, like these things all sat in each with, but it all sits in this space.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's something about you don't experience one harm, right? So this event that happened was catastrophic, devastating event, was very rarely the only one in any family. So there will be multiple harms. There will be sexual violence, there will be domestic violence, there will be economic violence, there will be you know, there will be so many different harms that are there. And they almost become, because of the way that we privilege one harm in our discussion around legacy, right? We've privileged deaths where injuries have been left really only seen through the prism of money, rather than understanding those impacts. And then all of the multiple harms that visited on families as well. So if we're supporting a family, they'll walk in through the door because they were in a bomb explosion or because they lost their brother, and then the other harms come up through the course of therapy and conversation, right? So this tells you the investment. This is a long-term journey. This isn't a one-off thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Andre's observation about like complex harm, complex layered harm, you know, and I think this one thing that does come out in the data is that we did track other losses in the family. So we were able to correlate some of this, the violent loss of a child with other violent or harm in the family's life. So it's again, this thing that like, these things are not evenly divided in society. Some of these families were at the epicenter of like just sustained harm over time. And I think the sort of privilege point, and it's one of the kind of complexities of engagement with legacy work. Like it's both, and you want to ensure that there's an understanding, an acknowledgement, and an accounting for the harms that happened. But of course, there are these hierarchies of harm, and in a weird way, like even as we're doing gender work in these spaces, we can be undoing our own best work because you're wanting to say like these other things that were happening in this are just as important, may have for some families may have been more significant. Like there isn't a one. So it's just to say, yeah, I think this is complicated as it engages with legacy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So women who experienced an attack on a family home, for instance, rather than the incident happening away somewhere else, that really matters and is rarely counted.
Yeah.
Do you know, the devastation of that safe space being violated, just the impact of that goes right across generations.
Yeah.
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 Monica at the back, and then Anna.
Hiya, sorry if my question seems a bit oddly specific. So my name's Monica, I do a PhD here. It's a Glasgow accent, I'm trying my hardest, but I've been home for 6 weeks and it's as bad as ever. You're lucky I'm not swearing. It honestly does not get better. It does not get better. But my question was, my PhD is co-sponsored by SAGE, and over this summer they had this big project on impunity. And like you said, they didn't want a hierarchy of harms, but they have torture, collusion and state killings, right? And I got a bit obsessed. as in want to do and possibly spent too much time on it. But one of the things that fell outside their brief, and I'm wondering if there's any I don't think intersectionality is the right word, was the amount of times women in interrogation would be threatened with the removal of their children, and sometimes their children were removed into state. It's not the same death of motherhood, but it's a threat to motherhood. And like, if they didn't comply, you're a bad mother. Like, you want your child to be in care. Like, that's what's going to happen if you don't comply. And it doesn't count as degrading or humiliating treatment. So it's
Oh, it
not.
does under Article 3 of the European.
So I have spent this whole time having this argument. I have put it on my spreadsheet. I've highlighted it because I had the same thing with obstetric harm, like denying someone maternal care. It's like not traditionally counted as torture, but if you leave a woman in labour and don't provide her with pain medication, right, you're doing that on purpose. So it's a thing that came up, and I was wondering if there's any intersectionality there, because I suppose it's quite a small percentage of the population, but it's not something they could talk about at the time because the men weren't given the same threats, if that makes sense, like to have their kids removed. Or not in that way.
So if you look at the official processes, right, there was an opportunity with the official processes around institutional abuse, historic institutional abuse, and now the upcoming mother and baby homes or whatever, that you could have done that intersectionality, but we are so bad at it. We don't, so it really will take, you know, us to notice and go, one of the most horrific parts of the historic institutional abuse was the murder of Bernard Taggart by the IRA, where he was abducted out of St. Pat's home with his twin brother, and both of them were tortured, and Bernard ended up being murdered. Their father had been killed by the British Army the year before, and their mother was coping with quite a very large family, and they had been taken into care during that time. At no point did I notice an official narrative that says, all right, see this stuff we're talking about, legacy of doing in the past, and see this stuff, let's join those up. We don't do that. And it's only when you do that through policy that you can really get it. Right.
Yeah, because it wasn't documented as a harm, and it wasn't, there was no recourse for it or anything. I just, yeah, that was my question.
So very specific. So I think this very interesting thing about, because one of the problems with interrogations is that, of course, we often don't have a record of interrogations, right? We don't know what was threatened, what was asked, but like there's very interesting, I think this question of that when a woman or a man is threatened with a kind of so I view maternality as an extension of kind of, it may be, I don't want to say sexuality, but of one's sort of identity, both reproductive and sexual identity, which is why I often think of maternality both as a separate harm, but a related harm to sexual harm, because the perpetrator knows that they're targeting, that there's an understanding between the victim and the perpetrator about what the harm is. Like when a woman is being told your children are going to be taken away, she understands the nature of what that communication is. And the perpetrator also understands the nature of that communication and what's packed into that threat. But law often misses the understanding that is actually is similarly situated between victim and perpetrator. And so I do think there's this very interesting way in which the kind of, and we see it in the jurisprudence on Article 7 ICCPR, Article 3 European Convention. If we look at what's happened at the European Convention, but even at the Human Rights Committee on what is inhuman and degrading treatment, I think what you're describing now, I think the committee and the court would be clear that that puts you into degrading treatment under the convention. So we have shifted our understanding. And I would also say for men, and maybe this is a little bit of us, but if we look at, for example, the cases involving the hooded men and how it took a decade, 2 decades for those men to describe what had happened to them as a sexual, some of them as sexual harm, right? So that there was, and there's some interesting, did they understand it as such when it happened? Was it only afterwards that it realized, or like, the societal context for a man to say, I have been sexually harmed in an interrogation? And that doesn't mean rape. It can mean, like, more often than not for men in interrogation in the early 1970s, it was genital harm. It was actually trying to stop men reproducing or having sex again. And that's a sexual harm. It was understood by the perpetrator as a way to do harm. And so I think we're getting better at understanding these things, but we're missing the shame that falls to the victim for being the subject of that kind of, is such a barrier to the articulation of the harm. Yeah.
Hello, hi, my name's Anna Bryson. I work here in the law school. I suppose I just wanted to begin by thanking you both so much. I think it is such an incredibly important project that opens up so many issues that, you know, hopefully over in the decades to come, we will finally begin to explore. And I think even as Monica was touching on there as a site of maternal harm, I mean, even around childbirth alone, there's so much that could be done. I was thinking of all the interviews I've done with men, often the 10 minutes coming out, thinking of interviews with ex-prisoners, prison staff and so on, but often their partners on the way out the door. And I'm thinking that, but it wasn't my fault. That's the way the project was set up. But I was clear in terms of noticing that that was where the work needed to be done in terms of picking up the snippets that were shared with you just literally, as I say, on the way out the door. But listen, this is annoyingly more a comment than a question. It's to kind of commend the model of working that you have, because you've been talking about safe ethnographic work, and you've also both so helpfully highlighted the complexity of the harms that people have suffered. So listening to you talking, Fionnuala, about, you know, within families, the complexity of these dynamics, like I always imagine at these different inflection points, whether it's bereavement, whether it's imprisonment, whether it's addiction of a certain family member as a result of that, as you said, Andre, at different points in the journey, it's almost like you press a reset button and the family dynamics shift, right? So the second eldest son becomes the father. The eldest daughter might, as mum falls into addiction or, you know, being prescribed Valium, becomes, and what does the eldest daughter do? You learn as a young teenager to suppress your emotions, your needs. So what the damage that does to you in terms of your development as a human being. You then have children, so the intergenerational, so I'm preaching, here I am preaching, you know this much better than me, but all of that is so complex. And when you talked about coping mechanisms and the safety of that blanket of silence, I suppose it just reminded me, listening to you, of the dangers of lifting the lid on all of that. And I have 2 PhD students sitting behind me here. And so I suppose what I'm just trying to sort of remind us all of is just of the enormous kind of challenge of all of that. And I think what I've listened to today is a wonderful model of how to do that ethically and safely and responsibly, because it is so incredibly sensitive and so incredibly complex. And so really, I'm just saying thank you and commending you both for your work.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Can I just say the footnote of, I do think there's a footnote around obstetric harm, which we didn't really touch on in this work, but I had a couple of children in the Royals, so but this has always struck me as, I remember doing an interview with a man who had been detained he was picked up during the 1972, and his partner was pregnant at the time. She was about to go into labor, and his trauma at, like, it wasn't being picked up, it was that he knew he was going to miss the birth of his child, or you know, so I think there's a whole set of, and then navigating the Royal at various points when it was militarized, when people were going into the maternity wing and being searched or asked questions, or husbands knowing they couldn't, or partners knowing they couldn't go in because they'd be stopped by police or military presence if they showed up. So there's something there that I think has been, it isn't, we know, but but I take the point to the PhD students, like, you know, anyway, Andre and I are friends, but I think there's something about in this society, because we're small, there's lots of places, I see it in the US where, like, I will have students come in and say, I think I'm going to go to Rwanda and interview some rape victims. And I'm like, well, then, over my dead body, you're probably going, but more that, like, but not viewing the victim, like that you have a right to interview somebody. You never have a right to interview somebody. And maybe you shouldn't be the person interviewing. And maybe an interview isn't what you should do, that like, yeah. And I'm struck by, like, how important it is that we just don't do that harm. You know, we stop ourselves as academics because we will be rewarded for doing things that harm victims. And so then how do you not?
No, I was just gonna add the obstetrics thing. I'm obsessed with it at the minute. I picked up a couple of stories recently. One, a woman whose interrogation started when she went into labor. She was involved in nothing. Her husband had been lifted. And so, you know, those stories are just chilling. Another, in a particular hospital where a woman refused to take pain relief going in. And as a woman who's had a couple of children, I mean, I can get that. But the fear was that pethidine was seen as a truth drug at the time. It was a drug of choice that you would, and if you were even just a bystander by living in a certain community, the story was that, you know, so I think there's a lot of specific maternal harm linked to obstetrics there that, yeah, could just as you say, Fionnuala, could perhaps be further explored. Sorry, Chilani, sorry.
Yeah, let me also just first thank you both. My name is Chulani. I'm a postdoc here, and I mean, I could really relate to what you're saying as somebody who's coming from a post-war context. And I think I was really struck by what you said about the men, that many of them died young in Sri Lanka. I know people say that many of the men fell ill, and, you know, wasn't there really to support the family in the way that they had done before. But in a context where a lot of the harm was also disappearances, I'm just wondering whether there's a difference in the way how women, the kind of labors of grief and mourning and the lack of closure, especially in the case of disappearances. And the fact that even though women experience the harm so deeply, that they're the ones who have to kind of carry the labors of looking for justice and the labors of memory, and kind of having to then reimagine themselves, right? Not just as mourning mothers, but also, you know, as claimants of justice. And whether the fact that here it's not so much disappearances, but death makes it somehow easier to find closure. I'm just wondering.
Yeah. So there's two things that occur to me. The site of burial is really, really important. So for a mother not to have that would be devastating. So we have a flower arranging class. And the reason we have a flower arranging class is because mothers didn't leave the site, the graveyards. They didn't leave the graves, and became very difficult for some mothers who were staying overnight, and they weren't safe. So we started a flower arranging class so that mothers would come and at least break that sort of routine that they had of getting up, going to the graveyard, coming, you know, so they had to come to another place where there were other people. And they put together the little posies to bring to the grave, because you're still recognizing that that's really important and that site is important. So we did that. For mothers who don't have that place, it is completely impossible. It is not a coincidence that it is considered the crime that it is. It is beyond criminal. And I can't remember now the second part of your question.
I don't remember. Was it about, I mean, I would agree that there's less disappearances, but there are disappearances here. We still have families who don't have bodies, and the centrality of grieving and death, and what's a grievable death, and who doesn't have the privilege of grieving, like Gaza, who does not have the privilege of grieving. What does it mean not to grieve? But I also think there's this interesting point you made about men and how, how do we understand men's functionality in relation to grief in a society where there's all these expectations of how you're supposed to function as a man through grief or not? Right.
Yes, that's so true.
Yeah.
I can think of a mother who, and it's not a disappearance, but the truth disappeared. So how did her 14-year-old son get abducted? What happened to him? Because his body, when it was found, was tortured and he'd been shot. And she's 91 from this month, and she still walks past the part where Philip was abducted from, looking for his teeth, right? Because he had no teeth when his body was found. And that speaks to all kinds of things. In the public domain, her name only appears on the legal aid form. in order to request the inquest, the reopening of the inquest, which she isn't getting now. That's the only place her name was in the legal sphere. Philip's name is there, but her name isn't accepted in there, and that's really important.
Just gonna drop a footnote, can we do 30 seconds? One of the things I did, but I haven't written it up yet, is I went into the Linden Hall archives and I wanted to cover all of the funerals of children who'd been killed to see if there were images of mothers, or so looking at paper, like to see how the media had covered maternal loss through images. And the thing that you just said, Andre, about her name, there's almost no images of women. And there's these pictures and because they have all the microfiches. So with one of my research assistants a couple of years ago, we went through all of them and every year trying to find images of the women so we could say, what did it look like? And there's almost none. I think we found 5 between 1969 and 1998, like just very few images of women.
I know there are more questions in the room. I am really sorry. We have another event in here very shortly. I think the fact that there are so many questions and so many areas for further discussion just speaks to the richness and the fantastic talk that you've given us this afternoon. I'm pretty sure I can speak for all of us that we're going to go away with an awful lot to think about. So thank you so much for all of you coming, but most importantly, thank you to Andre for sharing their work with us.